trusting the science is fine if it's kept to the things at which science is competent. But unfortunately, over the past few years, there has developed a trust in science that we now call scientism, where science is regarded essentially as the only way to truth, the only option for a rational thinking person, and everything else is fairy stories and all the rest of it. And I take great exception to that because it's plainly false. It's false logically, because the very statement, science is the only way to truth, is not a statement of science. And so if it's true, it's false. So it's logically incoherent to start with. But going a little bit more into it, it has had huge influence because of people like the late Stephen Hawking, for example, who wrote in one of his books, he said that philosophy's dead. And it seems now as if scientists are holding the torch of truth. And that's scientism. The irony of it is, of course, that he wrote it in a book where it's all about philosophy of science. And it's pretty clear that Hawking, brilliant as he was as a mathematical physicist, really is a classic exemplar of what Albert Einstein once said: the scientist is a poor philosopher. And my response to it is very much would be couched in the kind of attitude that Sir Peter Medawar, he's a Nobel Prize winner in Oxford here, once wrote. He said, it's so very easy to see that science, meaning the natural sciences, are limited in that they cannot answer the simple questions of a child. Where do I come from? Where am I going to? And what is the meaning of life? And it seems to me immensely important that we recover that. And what Medawar went on to say is we need literature, we need philosophy, and we need theology as well, in my view, in order to answer the bigger questions. Now, the late Lord Sachs, a brilliant philosopher, he was the chief rabbi of the UK and the Commonwealth and so on.
And one of the guests on this series.
And one of the guests on this series, well, I'm delighted to hear it, he once wrote a very pithy statement that I found very helpful. He said, you know, science takes things apart to understand how they work, and I suppose to understand what they're made of. Religion puts them together to see what they mean. And I think that encapsulates the danger in which we're standing. Science has spawned technology. We become addicted to technology, particularly the more advanced forms of it, like AI in my book, like virtual reality, the metaverse, all this kind of stuff. We've become addicted to it, but we've lost a sense of real meaning. And in particular, we've lost our moral compass. Einstein, again, to quote him, made the point long ago. He said, you can speak of the ethical foundations of science, but you cannot speak of the scientific foundations of ethics. Science doesn't tell you what you ought to do. It will tell you, of course, if you put strychnine in your granny's tea, it will give her a very hard time. In fact, it'll kill her. But it can't tell you whether you ought to do it or not to get your hands on her property. And so we're left in a scientific moral vacuum. And therefore, I feel very strongly that as a scientist of sorts, I need to challenge this. Science is marvelous, but it's limited to the questions it can handle. And let's realize it does not deal with the most important questions of life. And they are the question of who am I, what can life and does life mean, and where do we get a moral compass?
Before we come to artificial intelligence, then, I'd just like to explore what you've been talking about a little bit with reference to Britain. I love history. I've always massively admired Britain. And I know Britain seems to be into self-flagellation on just about every issue you can think of at the moment, the decrying of its own cultural roots. But to my way of thinking, I think in many ways Britain's been a force for unbelievable good in the world. I really do. I mean, as an Australian, I would not live in a free country if it hadn't been for the Prime Minister of this country standing up when no one else did in 1939. Just one minor example. But I come here now and I wonder just what the British people believe in. So massively shaped by Christian faith, arguments sometimes very ugly over a long period of time, but nonetheless profoundly shaped. The Times reported just a couple of years ago that we've reached the point where 27% of Britons believe in God, with an additional 16% believing in a higher power. Among the British as a whole, 41% say they believe there is neither a God or a higher power. Interestingly, those in the UK, young people, the number who said they believe in God rose a little, and nonetheless, what you've got here is one of the most secular societies on earth, which not so very long ago was one of the more Christian. What's responsible? Is it tied to a sort of false faith in science, amongst other things? Or is it just it's too hard? Or is it that the wars have seen people convinced that you saw two Christian nations fighting, people praying to the same God for victory? How did it morph so badly to a state of unbelief, do you think, the country that you've lived in your life?
I find this a complex and difficult issue because I see different strands in it. If you pick up on the science side, you go back to Isaac Newton, and he gave us a picture of the universe that was very much what's called a clockwork picture. The universe running on fixed laws that were, according to Newton, originally set in place by God. But it was a universe that essentially now ran on its own. And you can see that in the 18th century particularly favoured what's called deism. That is, there is a God, but he's hands off. He started it running, and now it runs, and it runs very well. And you can see with that in the collective psyche, particularly in the academy, it very rapidly led to questions of, is God really necessary? Now you add that to what was happening on the continent with the Enlightenment and the corrupt church professing Christianity, utterly corrupt, and the reaction against that, which was fuel to the fire, really, of a rising secularism and atheism. And then you add to that what was happening in the days around the time of Charles Darwin, where you had Huxley, who was an atheist, and he resented these clergymen who were actually some of them very good natural philosophers, like Wilberforce actually was a much brighter man than many people think, as Darwin pointed out. But Huxley in the UK, he wanted a church scientific. He wanted to turn the churches into temples to the goddess Sophia of wisdom, that kind of idea. So you've got all of that. And then you add to that the vitriolic anti-God sentiments that are not just atheism, but anti-God feeling, led for quite a long time by Richard Dawkins and other people. And that's had huge influence on young people. It's one of the reasons I entered the fray, actually, because the media then come into this. It's even more complicated because within the media, the dominant view, and I think the BBC actually stated this at one time, that they favoured naturalism, the philosophy that nature's all there is, and there's no outside, there's no transcendence, there's no God. So you've got all of that, and against it, you have a group of people who are often cowed into letting their faith in God become private. This is the tragedy of secularism. And you get into that, the cancel culture, the woke culture, all this kind of stuff, where I've got to affirm everything. Everything's equally valid. And you've got relativism and postmodernism, at least in things that people think don't matter. You'll never meet a postmodern business person who goes to a bank manager and says, I've got $5,000 in the bank, and the bank manager says, well, actually, you owe the bank 10,000. No, that's only your truth. No, that doesn't work in the business world. But still, you've got this pressure of relativism, and so you end up, as Michael Burke put it a few years ago, talking about faith in God in Britain, with the first generation that doesn't have a shared worldview. Now, there's still a Christian influence, as even atheists recognize, but we've gone a long way in rejecting God and abandoning God. And then there's the entertainment industry that will fill everybody's vacuum with noise, and we entertain ourselves to death. So your question is extremely complex, and it would need a more observant person than me to give you a full answer. It's a huge mix of stuff, and any individual person may be affected this in completely different ways.
The reason that it's important, I think, to set that up is we now come to what I really wanted to hear your views on, artificial intelligence, because science is giving us extraordinary capabilities.
Yes.
But will we simply be seduced by it in the sense that artificial intelligence is rapidly creating things that are marvelous, that we want to enjoy, that may satiate us, may dull us, while aspects of the emergence of AI could be very dangerous? But before we start to explore that, for ordinary people in the street like me who are not living with this, well, I am living with this stuff, but don't know where it might go, we need to define some terms. What is AI? I think you call it narrow AI, of the sort that we're quite familiar with, limited intelligence but highly focused on narrow areas. What is artificial general intelligence, and where might that go? There's a whole number of issues. Then there's the whole issue of transhumanism. So can we start with, very broadly, AI is what, John? How would you explain it to a layman? We've all heard the term.
Oh, sure. Well, the first thing to realize is that the word artificial in the phrase artificial intelligence is real. And that's not due to me, it's due to one of the pioneers of the subject who happens to be a Christian. And the point is that, and we'll take a narrow AI system first because it's much easier to explain. A narrow AI system is a system involving a high-powered computer, a huge database, and an algorithm that does some picking and choosing, whose output is something that it normally requires human intelligence to do. That is, if you look at the output, you would say normally that it's taken an intelligent person to do that. So let's take an example that is very important these days in medicine, and that's X-ray, interpreting X-rays. So we have a database. Let's say it has 1 million X-rays of lungs that are infected with various diseases, say related to COVID-19. They are then labeled in the database by the world's top experts. Then they take an X-ray of your lungs or my lungs, and the algorithm compares the X-ray of your lungs with the million very rapidly, and it produces an output which says John Anderson has got that disease. Now, at the moment, that kind of thing, which is being rolled out not only in radiology but all over the place, will generally give you a better result than your local hospital will. And that's hugely important and hugely valuable. But the point is, the machine is not intelligent. It's only doing what it's programmed to do. The database is not intelligent. the intelligence is the intelligence of the people that designed the computer, know about X-rays and know about medicine. But the output is what you would expect from an intelligent doctor. So it's in that sense artificial. It's a system narrow in the sense it only deals with one thing. And all kinds, endless kinds of systems are being rolled out around the world. And some of them, as you mentioned, are extremely beneficial. Narrow AI has been used in the development of vaccines, and the spin-off from that technology is enormous in drug development. And on it goes. And I could give you dozens of examples, and they're in my book. So that's where we start. Now, we are familiar with it, and it's worth giving a second example of it, because most of us voluntarily are wearing, first of all, a tracker. It's called a smartphone.
Yes.
It knows where we are. It could be even recording what we're saying. But what it does do, of which we're all aware, is if we, for example, buy a book on Amazon, we'll very soon get little pop-ups that say people that bought that book are usually interested in this book. And what's happening there is the AI system is creating a database of your preferences, your interests, your likes, your purchases, and is using that to compare with its vast database of available things for sale, so that it predicts what you might like. So this is of huge commercial value. And it leads to something else which most of us don't know about, and we can come to that later, but I'll mention it now, which is called surveillance capitalism. And there's a book by an emerita professor at MIT called Susanna Zuboff, and it's regarded as a very serious book because the point she's making is global corporations are using your data and without your permission are selling it off to third parties and making a lot of money out of it. And that raises deep privacy issues. So now you're straight into the ethics. So that's narrow AI.
Okay, so let's stay on narrow AI and extend our road a little bit further down towards broader use. You've just talked about us being unaware of, in a way, of how we're being surveilled.
Yes.
And it was right here in Oxford. I think it may have been you who made the point. I can't remember. In a talk that I heard, where the point was made that what's happening in China using artificial intelligence to surveil people is astonishing, but in many ways, all that information is being collected in the West as well. It's just it's not collated in the same way.
That's correct. And this is perhaps one of the scariest aspects of it. What we're talking about here is facial recognition by closed-circuit television. Well, it starts with facial recognition, but we've now got to the stage where in China in particular, they can recognize you from the back, by your gait, by all kinds of things. And what has happened is, and you can see the positive benefit, police want to arrest criminals or thugs or rowdies even in a football crowd, and so using facial recognition technology, they can pick a person out and arrest him or her. Well, okay, but what it can be used for good purposes in that sense, in keeping law and order, can also become, particularly in an autocratic state, become an instrument of control. And here's the huge dilemma which people try to solve. How much of your privacy are you prepared to sacrifice for security? There's a tension between those two things. Now, in China, you mentioned, and you're probably thinking about Xinjiang, where you've got a minority, a Muslim minority of Uyghur people. The surveillance level on them is unbelievable. Every few hundred meters down the street, They have to stop. They have to hand in their smartphones. The smartphones are loaded with all kinds of stuff by the government. Their houses have QR codes outside them as to how many people live there and all this kind of thing. And I don't know how many, it's way over 1 million, I believe, are being held as a result of what is being picked up by artificial intelligence systems in re-education centres. And the suspicion is that the culture is being destroyed and eradicated. That's the one hand. That's in one particular province. But elsewhere in China, we have now the social credit system that apparently will be rolled out in the entire country. We're given, say, you and I were given to start with, let's say, 300 social credit points. And we're being trailed. If we fail to put our rubbish trash can out at night, there'll be marks against us. If we go to somewhere dubious or mix with someone whose political loyalties are suspect, we'll get more negative points. On the other hand, if we pay our debts on time and go green, so to speak, and all this kind of thing, we will amass more credit points. And then, if we are going negative, the penalties kick in. We'll discover we can't get into our favorite restaurant. We'll discover we don't get that promotion or don't even get that job we apply for, or that we can't travel, or that we can't even have a credit card. And this is being rolled out, and the list of penalties and things that have actually been recorded is just very serious. Now, what amazed me when I first came across this was the fact that many people welcome this. They think it's wonderful. They boast, I've got 1,000 points. How many have you got? And they don't realize that the whole of life is becoming controlled in the interests, ostensibly, of having a healthy society. So it is, talk about 1984. Now, this is not futuristic speculation. This is already happening. George Orwell, you mentioned him, who wrote 1984. He talked about Big Brother watching you, and that technology would eventually, it is doing it. This is narrow AI. This is not futuristic in any way. It's what's actually happening at the moment. And you mentioned briefly the fact that all this stuff exists in the West, except, and the point has been made forcibly, it's not quite yet under one central authority and control, but it is coming. We have credit searches, we have all kinds of stuff that is beginning to creep in the US and in the UK, and I presume also in Australia. And also we have even police forces here, I believe, who want the whole caboodle in here and want to be able to exert a much more serious level of control. And it is frightening, because what it does for human rights is well.
So it occurs to me that, I love history, as I've mentioned. Authoritarian regimes have collapsed under their own weight. Typically, the people have risen up one way or another, and there's been an overturning. We've never had autocratic regimes that have had this surveillance capacity. There's, an estimated 400 million closed-circuit television sets in China. That's one for about every 3 people. I mean, it's mind-boggling.
Oh, it is mind-boggling. And even here in the UK, what I'm told is that you're on a closed-circuit TV camera every 5 minutes when you're moving around. So it is very serious. And of course, the irony is, as I hinted at earlier, here we are with our smartphones that have got all these capacities, certainly at the audio level, and we're voluntarily wearing them. So we're voluntarily ceding part of our autonomy and our rights, really, to these machines when we don't really know what is being done with all the information. So we have a huge problem. And someone has said we're sleepwalking into all of this, so that we're captured by it, we're imprisoned by it, and we wake up too late because the central authority has got so much control that we cannot escape anymore.